Daniel and Sara had been best friends since they were 12 years old. They met on the first day of 7th grade, in a crowded hallway, when Sara accidentally knocked Daniel's lunch tray out of his hands. Rice and curry went everywhere. Daniel stood there, frozen, staring at the mess on the floor. Sara looked at him with wide eyes, and then, instead of running away like most kids would, she got down on her knees and started picking things up with her bare hands. That was Sara. That was always Sara. They grew up side by side. Same school, same neighborhood, same group of friends that slowly got smaller over the years until it was really just the two of them. They studied together, failed tests together, celebrated birthdays together. When Daniel's father lost his job and the family had to move to a smaller apartment, Sara helped him carry boxes. When Sara's grandmother passed away, Daniel sat with her on the rooftop of her building for 4 hours without saying a single word, because she didn't need words. She just needed someone to be there. He was always there. By the time they were in their early 20s, Daniel and Sara had built something rare. A friendship that felt like home. They talked every day, sometimes about big things, sometimes about nothing at all. They had inside jokes that no one else understood. They knew each other's orders at every restaurant, every tea stall, every late-night dhaba they had ever visited together. People around them always asked, "Are you two together?" And they always laughed and said, "No, we're just friends. Just friends." That phrase became so normal that neither of them thought twice about it anymore. But something was changing, quietly, the way seasons change. You don't notice it happening. You just one day realize the air feels different. Sara noticed it first. She noticed it the way she noticed everything. Carefully, privately, without making a sound. She began to feel things she had no word for. Things that sat heavy in her chest when Daniel talked about other girls. When he came to her one evening, excited and nervous, to tell her he had developed feelings for someone, a girl named Maureen from his university, Sara smiled and asked all the right questions. What does she look like? Is she kind? Does she make you laugh? And Daniel talked for an hour, and Sara listened for an hour. And when he left that night, she sat alone in her room and felt something crack inside her, very slowly, like ice on a winter morning. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being selfish. Daniel deserved to be happy, and if Maureen made him happy, then Sara would be happy for him. That was what a good friend did. That was what she had always done. Put Daniel first, in every small and large way, without ever asking for anything in return. It was not a sacrifice that felt painful. It simply felt like love. She just hadn't admitted to herself yet what kind of love it was. Daniel pursued Maureen for a few months. He asked Sara for advice at every step. What to say, how to say it, when to give her space. Sara gave him honest, careful advice every time. She reviewed his texts before he sent them. She helped him plan a birthday surprise for Maureen. She even helped him pick out a gift, a bracelet with a small moon charm, because Maureen had once mentioned she loved the moon. Sara stood in the jewelry shop and pointed to the bracelet and said, "She'll love this." And Maureen did love it. And Daniel was thrilled. And Sara drove home that evening with both hands tied on the steering wheel, and the radio turned up loud, so she didn't have to sit with her own thoughts. The relationship between Daniel and Maureen lasted about 8 months. It was not a bad relationship. Maureen was not a bad person. But somewhere in those 8 months, something went wrong in the way things quietly go wrong. Not with a fight or a dramatic moment, but with a slow-growing distance, with conversations that got shorter, with laughter that became less frequent. Daniel started showing up at Sara's door more often again. They started having their long evening walks again, the ones that had slowed down after Maureen came into the picture. Sara noticed this, and she hated herself a little for the warmth she felt about it, because she knew it meant Daniel was hurting, and she never wanted him to hurt. When Daniel finally told her the relationship was over, he looked tired in a way she had not seen before. They were sitting at their usual spot, a bench near the old park in their neighborhood, the one with the broken fountain that had not worked in years. Daniel stared at the dry fountain and said, "I think I just wasn't ready. Or maybe she wasn't right. I don't know. I couldn't figure out what was missing." Sara looked at him and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You'll figure it out. You always do." He turned to look at her and gave a small smile. "You always know what to say?" She didn't, actually. She almost said something very different. She almost said, "I've been here the whole time." But she pressed her lips together and looked back at the fountain, and the moment passed, the way moments do when you let them. Life moved forward. Daniel healed. Sara watched him heal, helped him heal, was present for every part of it. She brought food when he didn't feel like eating. She made him come out for walks when he was staying inside too long. She sat through movies he chose even when she didn't like them. She was, as she had always been, completely and quietly devoted to his well-being. And still she said nothing about what lived inside her chest, because she had convinced herself that what she felt was secondary, that her role in his life was to support and not to need, that friendship like theirs was too valuable to risk. Then came the evening everything shifted. Daniel had been doing better. He was laughing more, making plans, talking about the future. They were at Sara's apartment that night, eating leftover biryani, watching some old comedy show, and he started talking about relationships again, about how he wanted to find someone real, someone who actually understood him. He said, "I think what I need is someone who genuinely cares about me. Not just when it's easy, but all the time." Sara nodded slowly. She was looking at the television, but not really seeing it. Daniel continued talking, and then he mentioned a new girl he had met recently, someone from a work event. He said she seemed interesting, and he was thinking about asking her out. He said, "What do you think? Should I go for it?" Sara put down her fork. She sat quietly for a second. Then she looked at him and said, in a steady and sincere voice, "You deserve someone who really cares for you. Someone who will be there, always. Someone who sees you properly." Daniel nodded, taking it as encouragement, the way he always took her words, as wisdom, as support, as his best friend looking out for him. He didn't hear the other layer inside those words. He didn't hear the weight of them. And Sara didn't say anything more. She picked her fork back up. She looked back at the television. And somewhere inside her, in that quiet, patient part of herself that had been holding on for years, something finally reached its limit. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way water rises. The way the truth, kept too long inside a closed hand, begins to press against the fingers. She knew, sitting there in that ordinary moment, that she could not keep saying nothing forever. She knew that something had to change. She just didn't know yet how it would happen, or what the cost of it would be. The next few days passed the way days do when your mind is busy with something you haven't said out loud yet. Sara went to work, came home, answered her messages, made her meals. From the outside, everything looked normal. But inside, she was carrying a question that had no safe answer. She turned it over and over in her mind like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. What do I do with this? What do I do with what I feel? She had spent years being Daniel's person, the one he called first, the one who knew his moods before he named them, the one who showed up without being asked. She had never seen this as a burden. It was simply what she did, because he mattered to her more than most things in her life. But now, for the first time, she began to ask herself a question she had been avoiding for a very long time. Was she happy? Not for him. For herself. Was Sara, quiet, careful, always present Sara, actually happy? The answer frightened her, because it wasn't simple. She loved being his friend. She loved their history, their rhythm, the ease of a relationship built over more than a decade. She loved that she could walk into his life on any given day and feel completely at home. But she was also tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired of caring so much and saying so little. Tired of being the strong one, the wise one, the one with the right words, when the truth was that she was not strong, not wise, and she had been running out of the right words for a long time. She didn't want to lose him. That fear sat at the center of everything. If she said something and he didn't feel the same way, what happened to them? What happened to Sunday afternoon walks and shared food and the bench by the broken fountain? What happened to 12 years of something that felt, in all honesty, like the most important relationship of her life? She couldn't imagine her days without him in them. And that, she realized, was both the reason she had stayed silent for so long, and also, maybe, a sign of exactly how deep this went. A week after that evening at her apartment, Daniel called her. He said he had met up with the girl from the work event. Her name was Annam, and they had coffee, and it went well. He sounded hopeful in the way he always sounded when something new was beginning. Sara listened and said the usual things. "That's good. She sounds nice. I hope it goes well." After she hung up, she sat on her bed for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She took out an old notebook, the kind with a soft cover that she used to write in when she was younger, and she started writing. Not a letter to Daniel. Just thoughts. Just the truth of what she felt, written down somewhere other than her own head. She wrote about the jewelry shop and the moon bracelet. She wrote about the rooftop after Sara's grandmother died, how Daniel had sat with her without words. She wrote about every small moment that had added up, year after year, into something she could no longer pretend wasn't there. She wrote for a long time, and when she finished, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly, but a kind of clarity, as though writing it down made it real in a way that thinking it never had. As though she had finally looked at the thing directly instead of from the corner of her eye. She wasn't just a good friend who had caught feelings at an inconvenient time. This had been there for years. Quiet, yes. Hidden, yes. But real. And real things, she was learning, do not disappear just because you decide not to look at them. The weeks that followed were strange. Daniel was seeing Annam casually. Nothing serious yet, he said, and he still made time for Sara the way he always had. Their routines continued. Walks, food, long phone calls. But something had shifted in Sara's experience of these things. Every conversation now had a second layer, something running underneath the surface of ordinary words. She was more careful with herself, more guarded, in a quiet way. She smiled at the right moments and said the right things, but she was also watching herself from a slight distance, asking, "Is this okay? Is this still okay?" One afternoon, they were walking through the market near Sara's apartment, the noisy, crowded kind with fruit sellers and fabric stalls, and too many people moving in too many directions. Daniel was talking about something from work, some minor frustration with a colleague, and Sara was listening, nodding, responding. And then he stopped walking suddenly and pointed at a small stall selling roasted corn and said, "Come on, we haven't had this in forever." They stood there eating roasted corn in the middle of the crowded market, and Daniel said something that made Sara laugh, genuinely laugh, the kind that comes up fast and catches you off guard. And in that moment, she felt both completely happy and completely sad at the same time, in a way she had not known was possible. Happy because this ordinary, easy, warm thing was what she loved. Sad because she didn't know how long she could have it the way it was. She began, slowly and without planning to, pulling back. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way Daniel would immediately notice. But she started being slightly less available. She let some calls go to voicemail and replied by message instead. She said no to a few plans, using work as a reason. She needed room to breathe. Room to think. Room to figure out what she actually wanted to do, now that she could no longer lie to herself about what she felt. Daniel did notice, eventually. He noticed in the way he noticed most things about her, without making a big deal of it, but clearly. One evening he texted her, "Hey, you okay? You've seemed a little distant lately." She stared at the message for a while. Then she typed, "Just tired. Work stuff. Don't worry." He replied, "Okay. But I'm here if something's up." She put the phone face down on her table. He was here. He was always here. And that was the whole problem, and also the whole point, and she didn't know what to do with either of those things. A month passed. Annam and Daniel continued seeing each other. It seemed to be developing into something more consistent. Daniel mentioned her more often, in a casual way that suggested she was becoming part of his regular life. Sara processed this with the skill she had developed over years. She absorbed the information, reorganized her feelings around it, kept her face even and her voice steady. And then came the day that changed things. It was a quiet Saturday. Sara was at home, reading, when Daniel came by unannounced, which was not unusual. He had done it 100 times before. He looked relaxed, easy, the kind of person who doesn't carry tension in his body. He sat on her couch and reached over to steal one of the biscuits from the packet near her, and said, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her book. "Sure. What is it?" He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Do you think Annam and I could be something serious? Like, genuinely serious?" Sara set the book down slowly. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that expression she knew well, the one where he genuinely wanted her honest opinion, not just comfort. And Sara sat with the question for a moment. And in that moment, something inside her, patient, quiet, long-suffering, simply stopped being patient. She said, "Daniel, can I ask you something first?" He looked a little surprised but nodded. She said, and her voice was calm, much calmer than she felt, "Do you ever think about us? I mean, really think about us?" He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She held his gaze. "I mean, what are we to each other? What is this, really? The room went quiet. Outside, there was the sound of the street, a car passing, children somewhere, the usual noise of life. But inside the apartment, everything was very still. Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. And Sara, who had waited years for the right moment, who had told herself again and again that the moment would never come, sat there in her own living room with her heart beating very fast, waiting. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Daniel's expression was shifting, surprise, confusion, something else moving underneath those that Sara couldn't name. She kept her eyes on him and stayed very still. She had started something now. There was no clean way back. He said, slowly, "What are you asking me, Sara?" She took a breath. She had imagined this moment in different ways over many months. In some versions, she was brave and clear. In others, she stumbled. What actually happened was something in between. She said, "I'm asking because I think I've been feeling something for a long time that I never said out loud. And I don't want to keep not saying it." Daniel didn't speak immediately. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. His face was serious in a way she didn't often see. She continued, not because she had planned these words, but because they came, finally, after years of being held. She said, "I know this is not easy to hear. I know we've always been just friends, and maybe that's all you see. But I can't sit here and help you figure out if Anam is the right person for something serious, when the truth is, I've been here. I've always been here. And I think part of me always hoped you knew that." The room stayed quiet. Then Daniel said, very carefully, "How long?" She gave a small, slightly tired smile. "A long time." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit she had seen 1,000 times when he was thinking hard about something. He didn't look uncomfortable, exactly. He looked like someone trying to see something clearly that had been in front of them for years, presented suddenly in a different light. He said, "Sara, why didn't you ever tell me?" She shook her head. "Because I didn't want to lose you. Because what we have is important to me. Because every time it felt like the right moment, you were talking about someone else, or healing from something, or moving forward, and I didn't want to be the thing that complicated your life." He looked at her with an expression that made her chest ache. He said, "You could never complicate my life." She looked at him steadily. "I know you mean that. But it's easy to say before it gets complicated." He was quiet again. "Then, did something happen? What made you say this now?" She thought about how to answer. She said, "You asked me if Anam could be something real. And I realized I couldn't answer that honestly while keeping this inside. It wasn't fair to you. And it wasn't fair to me anymore." He nodded. He seemed to be processing something very carefully, the way Daniel always processed things he took seriously. He didn't rush. He didn't fill the air with quick words just to make the silence easier. She appreciated that about him. She had always appreciated that about him. After a moment, he said, "I need to be honest with you too." She waited. He said, "I've thought about you. About us. More than once, over the years. There were times when something would happen and you were the only person I wanted to tell, and I'd think, why is that? Why is it always her?" He paused. "But I never let myself go further than that, because you were Sara. Because losing you would be the worst thing I could imagine. And I told myself that meant I had to protect the friendship, that I couldn't risk it." Sara absorbed this slowly. "So we were both protecting the same thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think so." They looked at each other across that quiet apartment. Years of history sat between them. Fights that lasted a day, memories that lasted a lifetime. All the ordinary moments that had built something extraordinary without either of them ever naming it properly. Sara said, "So what do we do?" He said, "I don't know. But I don't think I can pretend this conversation didn't happen." She nodded. "Me neither." He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that felt different from every other time he had looked at her, and yet also familiar, because it had the same honesty in it that everything between them had always had. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "All those times I talked to you about other people, all those times you helped me, gave me advice, sat with me through things. Was it painful?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sometimes. But I don't regret any of it. I wanted to be there for you. That was always real." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something closer to wonder. He said, "You're a better person than me." She said, "That's not true. We're just different." He said, "Maybe." The afternoon light was changing in the room. Neither of them had moved much. The biscuit he had stolen earlier was still in his hand, half forgotten. Outside, The street sounds continued. Ordinary life moving on, unaware. Daniel said, I stopped talking to Annam last week. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to make a big deal of it. But it wasn't going anywhere real. Sara looked at him. I didn't know that. I know, he said. I was figuring it out quietly. She nodded slowly. He said, I want to be careful. About us, about this. I don't want to jump into something just because of one honest conversation, and I don't want you to feel like I'm saying what you want to hear. You deserve more than that. She said, I know. I don't want that either. He said, but I also don't want to sit here and pretend I haven't thought about what we could be. Because I have. And now that you've said what you said, I keep thinking, how did I not see this? How did I not see you? She said quietly, I was always here. He said, I know. He looked at her gently. I know you were. The conversation didn't end with a dramatic declaration. It didn't end with music or tears or a perfect movie moment. What it ended with was something quieter and, perhaps, more real. It ended with two people deciding to be honest with each other about something they had both been carrying for too long. It ended with a decision, not to rush, not to pretend, but to actually look at what was there and give it the attention it deserved. Daniel left her apartment later that evening. Before he went, he stood at the door for a moment and said, Thank you for telling me. It couldn't have been easy. She shook her head. It really wasn't. He smiled. It was a different kind of smile than she was used to from him. Softer. More careful. Like he was seeing her differently and wasn't trying to hide that. In the days that followed, something between them shifted. Not dramatically. They were still themselves, still talking every day, still sharing ordinary things. But there was less pretending now. There was less distance between what Sara felt and what she allowed to show. And Daniel, for his part, was paying attention in a new way. He called when he said he would call. He listened differently. He showed up at her door one evening with her favorite mythi from the shop 2 streets away, just because, and stood at the door and said, I remembered you mentioned you were having a hard week. She looked at the box in his hand and then at him. She said, You didn't have to do that. He said, I know. I wanted to. She let him in. They sat together and ate the mythi and talked about small things, and Sara felt something she had not felt in a long time. The specific relief of being known without having to explain yourself. Of sitting next to someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay. It was not a simple thing. What was growing between them? It had roots that went years deep, and that meant it also carried weight. Memories, history, all the moments that had been one thing and were now being gently understood as something more. There were conversations ahead that would not be easy. There were things to figure out and things to be careful about. But for the first time in a long time, Sara was not carrying it alone. For the first time, she had said the true thing, and the world had not ended. The friendship had not broken. It had, instead, opened. She had spent years telling Daniel what he deserved, encouraging him toward people she hoped would make him happy. She had said those words to him across many evenings. You deserve someone who really cares for you. And that quiet Saturday afternoon, sitting across from her in her own living room, Daniel had finally heard the part she never said out loud. He had heard I wanted you. And this time, for the first time, he had listened.